Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth.
I truly believe that thoughts are the greatest vehicle to change.
We do not care whether the cat is black or white, as long as it can catch mice.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favorite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It is the attitude of the player, not their skills, that is the biggest factor in determining whether you win or lose, is a quote by the renowned coach Harry Sinden of the Team Canada ice hockey side, who played against the Soviet Union and were victorious in a thrilling and come-from-behind 8-game summit series. I thought this was an apt quote for our guest today, another proud Canadian who challenged orthodoxy on the international stage as global managing partner of one of the world's premier management consulting firms. Our guest today is Dominic Barton BBM, who is chair of Rio Tinto and chair of LeapFrog Investments. Dominic is a senior advisor and partner at AI investment firm Radical Ventures, the chancellor of the University of Waterloo, and an adjunct professor at Tsinghua University. From 2019 to 2021, Dominic was the ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China. From 2009 to 2018, Dominic was the global managing partner of McKinsey and Company. He was chairman of Tech Resources, a non-exec director at the Singtel Group and at Investor AB, and was an advisory board member of the Alayan Group. Dominic previously served as chair of Standard Chartered's International Advisory Council, chair of the Canadian Minister of Finance's Advisory Council on Economic Growth, and chair of the Seoul International Business Advisory Council. Dominic was a senior trustee of the Brookings Institution, a member of the Singapore Economic Development Board's International Advisory Council, and a member of the boards of Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City and the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. He has co-authored 4 books and received 8 honorary doctorates as well as a Rhodes Scholarship. Hello and welcome to another episode of No Limitations, a show where we speak to elite world-class performing men and women and unlock the secrets and influences that have shaped their destinies and that you could apply to your own life. For our first-time listeners from all over the world, please don't forget to follow on your preferred podcast platform and share with your friends and colleagues. And for our listeners in China, Canada, and South Korea, a big hello. I am your host, Greg Robinson, managing partner of Blenheim Partners, board and executive search firm. After growing up in Uganda and Canada, and later studying as a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford, Dominic recounts how he joined McKinsey in his early 20s and relished the responsibility of advising senior executives and captains of industry as a junior consultant. Following a chance meeting in Australia with then-Treasurer Paul Keating in 1989, who urged him to relocate to Asia, Dominic scaled the heights of McKinsey in the region and ultimately became global managing partner for nearly a decade. A common theme in the discussion is Dominic's belief in a renewed form of capitalism and the future engine rooms of growth in the 21st century. He also provides insight in relation to today's geopolitical landscape, such as the rise of China, the place for the United States in the global order, and the formation of new trading blocs in the developing world. Dominic also asserts that we are living in extraordinary times, with climate change heralding the biggest reallocation of capital in human history. Finally, Dominic closes with his views on best practice leadership and the willingness to unleash talent. So sit back and enjoy the dawn of new thinking. Dominic, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you've declared that we're entering a new form of capitalism. How does that theory stack up, bearing in mind what's happening on the world stage at the moment? We've got Israel, we've got Palestine, we've got broader issues around the Middle East, we've got China, Taiwan, We've got other plays. We've got Russia, Ukraine. Does it stack up, Dominic?
Well, I think, first of all, there's no doubt we're living in extraordinary times. I mean, there are so many forces that are at play. As you mentioned, climate change would be the biggest reallocation of capital in human history, all happening in the next 30 years. We've got the rise or re-rise of Asia in terms of its economic significance. That doesn't downplay the importance of the US, which I believe will remain the number one economy for decades to come. But most of the growth is now coming from Asia, and that will continue. You've got a geopolitical shift, the rise of China, and the fragmentation of kind of the international order. And then we've got technology that just is relentlessly changing. It doesn't care about geopolitics or climate change or anything. It's just changing. Artificial intelligence just being one of kind of at least 13 different technologies. Nano, we could go on about that. The way capitalism has changed is in a couple of fronts. One is that I think there's been a shift in capitalism over the last 40 or 50 years. It has become more short-term, narrow, and less owner-like, which is not helpful for the system. And that's why I'm a believer in long-term capitalism. And when I was at McKinsey, we would get called a lot of nasty names from time to time. But one I kind of liked was we were known as the Jesuits of capitalism. I looked at that a lot. And if you go back into if I could call it early stages capitalism, think about Adam Smith. He was not a short-term profit maximizer. He was a long-term, inclusive, owner-like capitalist. And I think that's what we need to move back. So that's what long-winded answer of saying our capitalism has to go back to what it was before. And given all those changes I mentioned, particularly the geopolitics, technology, and so forth, the idea that capitalism will trump everything is wrong. And I think there was a feeling of that in the mid 80s, early 90s, the fall of the Berlin Wall. To me, the peak of it was when George Soros took on the Bank of England in, I think it was 1992. So to have a hedge fund manager basically bet against the Bank of England, this established policy making and win.
Yeah,
and win. That was kind of like capitalism trumps, like, who cares? If you're a country, you obey the capital markets. And if you don't, you do it at your risk, right? Capitalism kind of defined the way. And that's just fundamentally changed now. So I guess there's two elements to that capitalism that's shifted: how it works itself, and also its important or weight in the whole ecosystem, to use a word that's used too many times. But, politics, geopolitics, polarization, media, that all has a much more important factor now than just capitalism by itself. And that's changed a lot since I started my business career. I started my business career in that world when capitalism was prime.
Under that sort of summary there, Dominic, is the world gone more left than it has right? And therefore, where does that play into that definition of capitalism?
It's a great question. I think it's actually gone both ways, which it's gone more left and right. It's polarized. We're kind of, instead of a curve, a probability curve like this is let's say the center where I think we were more of in the late 80s, 90s to the early 2000s. We've kind of gone like this. The center's just completely collapsed, and we now have, I'm not a very good actor here, as you can see, but we've got a big chunk on the left and a big chunk. This polarization is unreal. So I think the left and the right are stronger. Probably if I was to say which has the bigger bump, at least in I don't know. I'd say they're equal, because it depends on the country.
And just on that, Dominic, from your experience, which we'll come to in a second, do you think the US fully understands not just Asia, but China?
No, I don't. And I don't think it's just the US. I think in Canada, I think in Australia, I might say, in the UK, we don't really understand how China works. And I don't just mean that in terms of how the Communist Party works or the governance of the system. I'm talking about the civilization, the values, what matters, just how things work, the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, if you will. And we don't understand it. I've said before, I probably had 3 hours of education on Asia in my entire K to 12 experience. Korea has a 5,000-year history. There's lots of writing, there's a ton of philosophy, the way people work, and we don't have that understanding. And that's our issue, if you will. We need to know more. A person who actually kicked me in the ass to think about Asia, if I might say, is Paul Keating.
Oh, really?
I worked in Australia in 1989 for a year. I worked in Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, each for kind of 4 months. It was a strange thing. And the first project I did was with the ATO. And I couldn't believe McKinsey did work for I was kind of shocked coming. It just wasn't, I didn't know that. But anyhow, cut a long story short, Paul Keating was the treasurer, and we had 3 dinners. They had nothing to do with the project. But in the first dinner, and I remember I drank a lot of wine. I was a project manager at McKinsey, and he looked over me. I didn't really know who different people were. He looked over me and he said to me, "If you have half a brain," and he was silent, and he said, "I'm not sure you do, you would do well to move to Asia." I went, "What does this have to do with it?" He said, "That's where the future is. And I'm trying to encourage Australians to backpack in Asia, not in Europe." He was just this push. That was 89. So I think that understanding at a earlier age is really important, and we've got a big gap.
So where do you see the future in trade then? Because we're actually starting to see some very distinctive blocks being formed, aren't we?
Yeah. I don't believe globalization is going to go away. I think globalization will be there, but it'll be in a different form. It's generated so much value for consumers, for a way of life. If you think about...
Was that short-term, Dominic?
No, I think it's long-term, because if you look at, between the economists have some very good analysis, as has Rhodium and a number of other players. If you look at the cost of consumer goods in the United States with the rise of China, I mean, it's in the 15 to 20% drop level, like a vacuum cleaner. And this has a television, whatever you want to call, a basic consumer good has dropped. And that's because of trade. If you stop trading, that price will go up significantly. You get, the inflationary costs and so forth are high. So I think it's had a huge benefit, and I think it's going to be very difficult to break it down. But what has shifted is to your point, what I believe be more regional blocks. That's where there will be more intensive trade. So the US, Canada, Mexico will be a very important region. Obviously, the Eurozone, ASEAN, India, China, but also MENAP, Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, Sub-Saharan. If you think about South America too, there's 3 or 4 countries together that will be doing much more together. So I think if you're a global company, you better start thinking about your positioning in these blocks. If you're a country thinking about your diplomatic configuration and what you're doing, you better start thinking about these blocks and how you interact with them, because they're going to have more weight than the general global system.
So there's only one part of your career as the former Canadian ambassador to China. You've obviously got experience in building relationships. This is where the issue seems to be short and longer term at the moment. How does countries be smart about building these relationships, Dominic? Because the blocks are there. They're getting stronger.
I think that this is something that really matters to me, or I feel it's really important to me, is the fabric between countries. And it's not just the G to G level. And that if I think about it, again, it's sort of an iceberg. There is a government to government level, but there's a ton of other linkages, the business to business side of it, the cultural side, sports, academic. There's a range of things. And I think it's very important for us, no matter what the G to G relationship looks like, that we are working to deepen that fabric because it helps us have a better understanding. It actually can build trust. Governments change. When I was the ambassador in Canada, a couple of very simplistic observations. One is that the G to G relationship was terrible. It had completely broken down. No one could communicate. The Chinese side would not respond. They were extraordinarily angry about the Meng Wanzhou situation. They felt, we'd gone from this golden era, literally November 2018, the peak of relationship, 23 minister to minister relationships, to mid-December, nothing, like no communication, and 2 Canadians being detained and all of that, and the trade cut. We've experienced this in Australia too, right?
Yep. Yeah. We just had some release just recently.
Yeah. And so what matters is actually these relationships, because for me to be able to operate there, I had relationships from the time I was there in 2003 to 2009. And those relationships were really important because part of it is figuring out how decisions get made. It's opaque. It's an opaque system. You have to have people help you. And secondly, Canada invested a lot it was the Canadian International Development Agency, poured in humongous amounts of money, resources to train Chinese people in healthcare, judicial system, and all of that. So those things that were done in the 90s, where you had vice ministers that had actually been trained at McGill, for example, or UBC or University of Toronto, they wanted to talk to Canada, even though the official relationship was bad. They felt a connection, and they were a channel, a really important channel for me to be able to talk and get things done, because I had to go informal. Formal was broken. So I went informal, and I met anyone. I would meet the local street sweeper if they would meet. I met anyone I possibly could, because you had to figure out where the channels were. And those certain relationships, we should be more deterministic about how we build. I mean, one thing, just a small anecdote. I remember, when I got there, a previous ambassador sent me a note. It came in a, secret pouch and all this stuff. And I got it. It came like 6 months after I'd been there. I don't know why it took so long. And I opened it up, and in it said, these are 35 people you should meet, right? You're there. Now, with not a criticism to my 2 predecessors from when I was there, these were names that if I was a monkey, I would meet them because I was in the role. And what shocked me was, for a country with a 50-year relationship, is all we can say is we've got 35. And this is not a criticism of him. It's a criticism of our bilateral relationship. I think that's a challenge, and so one of the things I was focused on was there are 750 relationships that we need to make sure we have. And that's not just the top 7 or trying to understand where they are. It's the customs officer for pork in Nanjing. That person, that's a big deal for us, right? And that person plays a critical role, because the Chinese and the Japanese and the South, they're more deterministic about it. In fact, Singaporeans, they're very thoughtful about these, and they're long-term. These are relationships for life. They're not transactional relationships. We're not used to that. We sort of, we change. The other thing I noticed, we change our ambassadors every 3 to 4 years. The Russians are there for 12 years. The Singaporeans are there for 10 years. The Vietnamese are there for 10 to 12 years. And so when you I spent time with the Vietnamese ambassador. I mean, these, they know China deeply. We're kind of flipping people, and that's not going to cut it, I think. So these relationships are extremely important, and I think they can be done in different ways. The other thing, I'm actually just talking today to a group at Cambridge on this topic of the fabric. And if you look at the the depth of the Cold War, and actually the fabric that was still there. So I'm just looking at it this is from a Canadian side and also a US side. People felt it in Canada as a country, was the hockey series. There was the Canada-Soviet hockey series, which did an unbelievable amount. It was an incredibly tough series. And because Canada thinks we're the best in the world at hockey, and all of a sudden these Russians came and kicked our ass, and it was a shock. And it ended up, Canada won it in the final game in Moscow. It was like a 7-game series, and we won it in Moscow. And Canadians, any Canadian who was around at that time will remember it viscerally. And there's actually a relationship with the Russian people, not the Soviets, but there's a kind of a link. There was a joint Arctic research mission that was done on ice, believe it or not, ice melting between Canada and Soviet scientists. That became a channel. We probably wouldn't do it now, but that became a channel. There were ministers in Canada that traveled to the Soviet Union at that time that no one knew about in terms of just the connection. So the US and China worked on polio eradication in the real depths of eradicated it. There are things like that I think even in times of extreme stress, we should be connecting. That I think is important to do it. And we need to be more deliberate, and we need to have younger people do it.
So we're leaving too much on the table, are we?
Yeah, way too much. With these blocks, for example, Africa is going to be, if I was Paul Keating now having a conversation with me now in 2029, I think he would probably say, do you have half a brain? And he'd probably still say, I'm not sure you do. And then he'd say, you should be in Africa. I think that's what he would say, just because over the next 20 to 30 years, that place, to the youngest demographic, it has to transform. And we don't know enough about it. We call it Africa. We don't recognize that there's talk about relationships. There's a lot we can be doing in Australia, in Canada, in the UK, in the US. China is doing a lot in Africa and has been at an order of magnitude more significance than all of us combined.
Well, I think a lot further ahead than all of us combined as well.
Exactly.
This is a leadership discussion. And if we stand back and look at the world at the moment, are we seeing strong versus weak leadership? And as a result of some weak leadership, are we seeing some very bad outcomes?
Yeah, I'm worried about the leadership. I think we don't have enough leadership. I think being a leader, especially a political leader in these times, is very, very difficult because of the forces we talked about at the very beginning of this conversation. One is a polarization. You've got a look at the United States, but it's happening in every country. There's polarization. I feel it is in Australia. You have a better view than me, but I think it's happening there. It's in the UK. And that makes it very difficult to lead because your base we don't have as much common ground. So I think there's an element of the context that makes it harder to lead. I don't want to cut slack for leaders, but I think that's an element we have to think about. But then I do think there has to be more of a long-term view on things. And we don't have that. We have a very short-term sense of leadership. The person who probably has the most long-term leadership is President Xi.
So those people who are supposed to be followers of the leaders, are they turning off because of that? So in Australia, for example, we vote every 3 years. A year out, they're electioneering. So 2 years to run a country. Very, very short-termist. So am I going to be engaged or am I going to turn off?
When you said that, I was also thinking about Congress in the US, right? Every 2 years.
Yeah, at the moment.
We have a lot of fundamental issues that will not be done in a quarter. That gets to the capitalism point. You don't transform a company in a quarter. You can't measure that. Things may go down before they go up. I think in a country, we've got fundamental education issues. You can't fix that in a term. We've got healthcare related issues. You can't fix that in a term. We've got fundamental manufacturing. I think this is an area that in Australia, in Canada, the United States, the UK, we've hollowed out our manufacturing. Interesting, the longer term, Singapore, China, Malaysia, they have a kind of a belief that you have to have a minimum part of your economy be manufacturing. And in China, for example, it will never go below 25% of GDP. That's just like a rule. And I think there's rationale to that, and we should be thinking about those things. But that's more we have a lack of long-term thinking. And I do think our election systems exacerbate that significantly.
Leads me on to the next one, Dominic. You're no stranger to walking into some troubled times, even as the role as ambassador. That was obviously challenging. People were being detained. You did the work through that. You've had some interesting times at the role the helm at McKinsey. And obviously, Rio's got a big influence across the globe. Bearing all that in mind and what you've seen and what we just talked about from the political landscape, but to you, and you've advised many of them, what is genuine leadership then?
It's a really deep question. So let me just try and break down how I would think about it. One is, I think, a leader has to have a vision or a kind of direction about where they want the organization to go. And I think it's got to be long-term. One of the big reasons I was attracted to Rio Tinto is it is a 20 to 30 year time frame company. And I think mining companies are, they have to think in that time frame. So I love that. It's because it just changes your bearing. So, but you have to, I think, if you're a leader, you have to have some sort of long-term view. But I also believe it's something I learned from a former finance minister in Canada. I used to, when I was at McKinsey, always ask leaders, what would be the one thing you'd teach your 21-year-old self if you could do it again? And this guy said, I would have learned to have had a microscope in one eye and a telescope in the other and not get a headache. And I said, what the hell do you mean by that? And he said, let's think about it. He goes, I'm the finance minister. I have to have a long-term view of the competitive positioning of Canada over a 20 to 30 year period. At the same time, I won't use his word, crap happens, right? Things happen immediately, and I've got to be able to react to that. But most leaders, he said, are either one or the other. You need to be both. So I think there's this notion of you have a vision, but you're agile in terms of reacting or dealing with things, but you got to have both. You certainly are not short term. The other dimension I'd want to get into, I think it's more about the character of the leader, the who you are, than what you do. And we spend a lot of time advising leaders on what they need to do, how they should spend their time. Think about your organization structure, think about your strategy, manage your risk, think about your leadership team. Those are all really important. What we don't think enough about is who you are. And this is elements of selflessness. It's very easy as a leader to get more selfish, thinking you know everything, but you become a machine that's working so hard. The machine has to be serviced. You need to get whatever you need to keep the thing going. And you can get into this, you can become detached from reality. So this selflessness, groundedness is an important element of character. And people know if you're bullshitting or not, whether you're real or not. So but that's really important to stay that way. I think the second is I'd call your ability to absorb. A lot of leaders get into trouble because you're tired, you're working hard. There's just a lot of flack coming at you and you lose it. You say something inappropriate, you overreact. Sometimes part of a job of a leader is to absorb what you're doing. I think your nose for people is what you know extraordinarily well, amongst many other things. You've got to know when you're looking for, this is where people is. And one just again, sorry, sidebar on this. I'm sorry I wander around a lot in the conversation, but one of the last books I wrote when I was at McKinsey was on talent. And I'm embarrassed to say that because it's actually the most important thing. If I tell my 21-year-old self, again, it's just focus on the people. Take people out faster, move people up faster, spend time with people, that. And I remember it was Larry Fink was one guy who spoke to, probably the biggest investment firm in the world. You think about an investor. And I remember him telling me once, he said, Dom, you need to think about me all the time as a pig who's looking for truffles. Those truffles are people. So wherever I go, I'm looking for talent. Yeah, that's what's on the paper of what I do, but actually I'm looking for talent and I'm focused on talent. So that's a capability in leaders. You need to learn that and that to me is a character thing. I think people like, if you like working with people or they're objects by which you get things done. So I could go on, but it's this long-term, short-term, more an emphasis on long-term, and this character. There's a whole bunch of other elements in character that I think make you an effective leader or not. And we don't spend really any time focused on the character. We focus too much. We don't spend as much time on the who. We spend all the time on the what. And I think we have to rebalance that.
Do you think really good talent is allowed to flourish? And what I mean by that, I had an interesting experience not long ago where a senior executive was asked to go into an MBA, quick course, did it, and at the end, for the final evening, was asked by the lecturers, what are your thoughts? And there was the international audience there. And what did you learn? And put his hand up and said, look, thoroughly enjoyed it, but it's not going to change a thing. And everyone was silent. Why is that? Well, I've absorbed so much, to use your words. I've taken on so much, but I'm going to go back to the machine. And when I go back to the machine, the boss is going to say, just do what I tell you to do and keep going. Your organisation, McKinsey's, has evolved, but there is something being lost out there on that talent, is there not?
Your question about are we unleashing talent, I think the answer is no, we're not. I think there's a way more potential. And there's another dimension that we don't look at. There's many, that's a whole different topic. Like, what measures do we look at with people and organizations that we should look at that we don't? And this potential, I think, is a huge one. And I'm a true believer in that if you chuck people, metaphorically, in a swimming pool without them knowing how to swim, most people figure it out and they grow. They grow dramatically. Short answer to your question is, I think we do not unleash talent like we should. And your notion of that fellow going into the machine, I totally, that resonates. And I think this is what organizations can do much more of. Give younger people a chance. I mentioned that theme, right? That this was a common theme of all the CEOs. I think I met 3,500 in the time in McKinsey, and I would ask that question about the 21-year-old self and where it is. Whether you were in Asia, North America, Europe, I don't care what industry, people was the core focus of what people how they would have spent their time differently. And as I said, there were three elements of that. One was take people out faster, because I think there's it's very hard to do that. It's uncomfortable. It's not. And so people delay it, and it blocks and I think can destroy organizations. And second, give young people more of a chance earlier. Throw them into the swimming pools. Put them into things. And this is where I think in today's world too, we have to think about a different organization design to give people more space. The idea that organizations are pyramids by definition makes it more machine-like. And I think what you got to try and do while still having controls and so forth is flatten it to allow people to be able to have the room to move. And not only would I say, by the way, it's not only young talent that are not unleashed enough, should be given way more opportunity early. And I mean big opportunity early. I also think we focus too much on degrees and back, this person went to this university and I couldn't give a shit about that. One of the last things I did when I was in McKinsey, I would try and challenge orthodoxies, right? Because orthodoxies are what make you disappear as an organization if you're not careful. So you may not want to change them, but you should challenge them. The only one I would not want to challenge in McKinsey is values. That there's a way you work, what you believe in, if you will, but everything else should be put on the table. And then one of the last things I focused on was we are going to hire 5 people with no university degrees. And that freaked people out. They were like, what are you talking about? No university. I said, no, there's talent out there and they said, well, what will our clients say if someone shows up? I said, the client's not going to look at their CV. They're going to, is this person a leader? Do they have an idea? And I'm happy to say that 3 of the 5 that were hired are partners. So again, I think we have these the background of the person. It's about give people a chance and experiences, take risks. If I reflect on my own career, from whatever I've learned and done, it's because I've taken risk. People have basically chucked me in a pool. And that's where the growth has just been dramatic, because it's like just going into an accelerator. So when I moved from, actually, that experience in Australia, that 1 year in Australia as a project transformed my life. I mean, that was the Paul Keating kind of, you got to move. It changed my people. The other thing I took away is and I'm generalizing, you have to be very careful with this, but in Australia, the kind of level of understanding of microeconomics, like, you don't mess with people. People understand economics deeply. There's kind of this like an intellectual rigor. I felt it was like a wake up call for me. And then when I went to Korea, I all of a sudden became the office manager at, like, I was 32 years old. I didn't speak the language. I had no relationships. The translation of McKinsey in Korean, with the sound sounded like Kentucky Fried Chicken. I mean, we had nothing. And then we had a financial crisis, and it was growth on steroids. And I learned so much. Then moving to China. So these moves or experiences are what I think, honestly, I could have been, again, it doesn't matter who I was. It was the experiences that transformed me. And so we need to give more young people experiences to grow the hell out of them. That's how I feel.
You talked about experience. You talked about values. You want to share a little bit about your background when you grew up? So you're born in Uganda, is that correct?
Yeah.
And there was a guy called Idi Amin floating around in a few years' time, and Dad was a missionary, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right. I was there till I was 7. And when I was 5, it was 1967. Idi Amin, he hadn't gone crazy at that time. He was kind of a well-regarded, like, brigadier general. And he took over our house because there were terrorists in the, like, jungle, literally where we lived. Like, I was going to say guerrillas, but I mean, the different type of guerrilla, the terrorist type of guerrilla. So, and they took over our house. I remember my dad said to me, he said, "We're all going to live in your room now for the next couple of weeks." And I said, "What? No, we're not." He goes, "No, we are, because the army's taking over the house." And I said, "Oh, no, I don't like." I said, "Well, you don't really have a choice." And Idi Amin had this Land Rover, which I loved Land Rovers. And I used to play in the back of it, and I was told not to. And to cut a long story short, one day the Land Rover started driving off while I was in the back. So I hid for a bit. I remember this vividly, because then I thought, okay, that's not going to work because this car is driving away. So I literally picked up the blanket and then banged on the glass, to the cab in the front. And all I remember was this big head, black head with white teeth. Because I think he was a bit shocked that there was someone, like a stowaway, in his car, and he pulled over, and he was wearing this incredibly, like, a crisp white uniform, and he picked me up by my short. I was just wearing shorts. Picked me up by the shorts like a starfish, put me in the front. And I remember I couldn't really see out the side. I just looked at him because he was a big, huge guy in this white, crisp thing. He drove back, came up the front. My parents were obviously freaked out, and he came in the front. He walked around the front, picked me up again like a starfish, and then sort of dropped me down in front of my dad. And he said, "You should be very careful where your boy plays."
Yeah, right.
And then he went back into the car and drove off. And I think it was 2017. I got my Ugandan passport. I have it here from Museveni. I went because he wanted to give me he said, "You're born here. You should have a passport." He gave me this passport, and he was wearing all his military stuff. And he'd heard this story, I guess, because he says, "Is it true you met Idi Amin?" And I said, "Yeah, I did." And he said, "I think you can be the only person to say that Idi Amin saved you, as opposed to killed you." It was because he obviously came in to clean up things there. But anyhow, yeah, sorry. So Africa has always been in the blood, so to speak. So Africa, then we moved to Toronto and then Vancouver. That's where I really grew up, in a farming community just outside of Vancouver, a dairy farming community. And I always wanted to travel, or I always wanted to. We didn't have enough, money to really do that. Sort of, we would do one trip, but I really wanted to travel. And I remember going to Vancouver once a year was a big trip. I remember this was a huge deal to go into Vancouver. So I was yearning to get out, if you will. Really ever since then, I've been living around the world.
Well, how much did your mind change? You talk about travel. You did travel to England and you studied Rhodes Scholarship. How much did your mind change or develop during that course of time?
That was another one of those kind of being dropped in the pool. It changed for a couple of reasons. One is the method of teaching was fundamentally different than it was in Canada, where I would argue, you take the teacher in the university is giving, a lecture, you take notes and you try and remember what they said in the exam, and you kind of, these are the books you read. And to me, I remember the instant of kind of the dawn of a new way of thinking about it. I was with my colleague who was from Arkansas. He was a Rhodes Scholar from Arkansas. He and I were in this meeting our supervisor, and the supervisor said, "Look, I want you to write 3 essays for next week," right? And he gave the topics, and he said, "So I'll see you later." And I went, "Hang on a second. What, you're not going to teach us about this stuff?" And he goes, "No." And I said, "Well, what should we read? Do you have at least like a reading list you're going to give us?" And he goes, "No, I don't." And I literally said to him, "What's your job? What exactly are you doing here?" And he said, "That's not a question you should be asking, because I'm the supervisor. You need to figure out what the books are to read, and you better figure out the right books, because if you don't, your essay will be poor, and that'll be a consequence for you. So you have to figure it out. You got to learn something." So it was learning how to learn. It literally was, and there was no internet back, like I'm an old guy, right? So I was like, what the hell? The topic, I couldn't Google it. So you had to just basically figure out how to research. And that way of thinking and learning was fundamentally different.
Well, he's doing his job. He's teaching you to think.
That's exactly. I totally agree. And that I just didn't know that. I think part of the things in life is you just don't know what you don't know, right? And that was just a shocker to me. And I actually got upset with him, right? I literally was like, what the hell do you do? Like,
but that's an interesting perspective too, Dominic. Not knowing what you don't know doesn't seem to faze you.
No, I think this is where I think we have to be curious and absorb. Like, if someone says something to you that you find, maybe you might even find offensive, or just before reacting, think about it. Go, wonder why they're saying that. Maybe there is something you don't. So I just think that, and this gets back to your earlier question too, about what we know about China or what we know about Asia. There's so much we don't even know what we don't know.
All right. So you start on your career. I know you spent a very short period of time with Rothschild, and then McKinsey. Why did you make the move to McKinsey?
I made the move mainly because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I really wanted to work at the World Bank or the IMF. I didn't even get a response. I applied. I didn't even get no. I got nothing. Zero. Nada. And McKinsey, I had no idea who McKinsey was. I mean, I honestly thought it was some cult or something, because and to be with you, I only went to the introductory session because I heard that they serve free alcohol. And so I thought, I'll just have a good drink. I'll have a drill, it'll be good. So I went, and the presentation was terrible. As people stood up, I joined McKinsey and I do this. I was kind of like, these are not people that I want to work. Like, it didn't click. And then I didn't have a job, and and then they kept saying, this is a place you can come and you can figure out what you want to do. And it was really through the interview process. I met people maybe that were more like me than what I thought McKinsey people were like. There was a guy who was I'm not like this, but it was sort of, he was not an MBA type of person. This was a person he was a nuclear physicist, and he was a business guy. And I remember saying, what are you doing? And he said, doesn't matter. Let me just tell you what I'm working on. And then what he was working on fascinated me. And he said, just come here for 2 years and you don't have to stay. We're not trying to keep you, actually. If you don't, you made a lot of people leave after 2 years. They kind of figure out what they want to do. And this is kind of like a graduate school. That's how he positioned it. So that's what I thought. And I genuinely thought I would leave after 2 years, but I loved the work and the learning. Again, it was being put in a machine that just is going to be formally and informally, just every day you're learning with clients. There's very formal. We had a mini MBA, and again, classic McKinsey style. It wasn't 2 years, or it was 1 month, and it was intense beyond, accounting, marketing, operations, and that was done religiously. And I could see how it was changing me. But probably the most important thing again was mentorship. It wasn't, and by the way, it wasn't the McKinsey people so much. There was some great mentors there. It was actually clients. So I learned that whole point about people without a degree. There was the guy who used to run Dial Corporation, John Teets, who I loved. This guy, classic American, my image of a CEO, kind of, 55-year-old, kind of a tough, like a Jack Welch type, like a tough ass sort of guy. And I was so naive. I would on the can on McKinsey, it says you serve top clients. So I'd been in McKinsey for 6 months and I didn't see myself advising CEOs. And I was kind of shocked. Like, you imagine how idiot. And so I would tell the guy, I said, I've been here 6 months and I'm not advising any CEOs. And I remember the senior partner was like, this guy's a whack job. So he brought me to a meeting with this guy, John Teets, who is like 8 levels above. And first thing this guy, John Teets, does, I remember he was sitting at the edge of it, like it was classic business thing, like a long table. He's at the end of the table. He'd broken his back before, like, so he was a body, like a tough guy. So he was sort of on an angle like this. And he looked at me and he was shocked to see stuff because I looked really young like that. And Bob Felton, senior partner, he goes, Bob, who's this Smurf you brought from San Francisco? Because Bob was from San Francisco. And I said, what? And he didn't even look at me. And he looked at me and says, does the guy even know how to shave? Like he went, and I was like, shit, how am I going to counsel this guy? Right. And then in the meeting, halfway through, I was telling him because I figured out this route profitability they owned Greyhound bus lines. That was just a small division. So I'm really proud of this work. I'd figured out the route profitability, and I was telling him, he was asking, he's going, oh, really? Is that right? I didn't realize he was actually, he was like, that's fascinating. And then he went like this. And the vice president who I knew actually quite well, he said, hey, Dom, when John does that means he's going to fire someone. And I was like, holy shit, this guy's going to, and sure enough, John Teets goes, time out. And you, Smurf, you're coming with me. And he took me into his room and he just beat the crap out of me. He said, first of all, he goes, I find you offensive. You have these ideas. You're so proud of yourself for these ideas. Did you think I haven't thought about this stuff before? Do you think I'm some sort of moron? I remember this, and I was taking notes. And then he said, and he goes, by the way, I think you're pretty proud of your background. I just get this feeling that you're really kind of, and I said, I hope I don't. And he goes, it oozes out of you. Your arrogance oozes out of you, and it disgusts me. And I was like, well, this isn't going that well. And then I said, he goes, why did you join McKinsey? And I said, because I want to counsel CEOs. And he goes, how do you think that's going? I said, probably not very well. And he goes, you're goddamn right, it's not going well. I think because I was so shocked and on it, he told me, he said, listen, I just got some advice. He goes, what I want you to do, you've done all this analysis. I want you to go spend time with the bus drivers, because these people actually probably know something. Just because they're bus drivers and don't have an MBA or whatever the shit you have. Like he goes, they probably know a lot more than you'll ever know. So, and I did, I remember, and he goes, I want you to come back next week and tell me what you learned. And so I did. And it became a thing. And he became a very close friend. He would still tease me. Like I remember one of the ones, we were starting to get to know each other. He brought me into this room again. And again, it would freak the management team out because they didn't know what was going on. And then he said, listen, he goes, Dom, I want you to stay over. It was in Phoenix. And I was like, I want you to stay over this weekend. And I'm bringing my CFO and general counsel. And I said, oh, is this like your kitchen cabinet? He goes, yeah, exactly. My kitchen. And I was like, wow, I'm being invited to the kitchen cabinet. Like, this is how, and he could tell I was getting excited. And he goes, but the reason I'm inviting you is because our babysitter's sick. So I need you to take care of my kids. I was like, oh, I'll never, but he would, I learned so, in those experiences, I never would have got that at Oxford or anywhere. And that guy, and I love him. He unfortunately died of Alzheimer's. I would visit him after, like, he'd long retired, because what he taught me was just unbelievable. There are many people you get exposed to like that, which I think just grow you. That's why I stayed.
If we leap it forward, so I appreciate your experience in Asia, and chairman of Asia in Shanghai, and promoted, and one day, the number one role, managing partner, global managing partner, McKinsey, for the next 9 years, plus emeritus as well. What did you set out to achieve?
I had a lot of things on my mind. I did have a long term. I wanted us to be an influential organization, and that sounds very vague. To help change the world, if you know what I mean. I said we have all this amazing talent. How do we do that? And what I was worried about is there's a lot of organizations that over time disappear. They were great organizations, but they don't become relevant. And one of them, it was actually James Gorman, who was about 2 years ahead of me. He was always he was 2 years ahead of me, but like 10 roles ahead of me. So I would talk to him, and I remember him telling me about, he was at Morgan Stanley, but how there was a law firm that Morgan Stanley used to work with, which was very influential. Apparently they would have, like a lunch every week with the top management of that law firm with the top management of Morgan Stanley. That was in the 50s. And what I remember from the story was by the 90s, no one even knew who the law firm was. They were irrelevant. They were very successful. They were a profitable, successful firm, but they were irrelevant. So being relevant, and the world was changing. At the time, this is where I felt Asia, all the stuff I'm talking about, forces, I felt we were very still Anglo-Saxon. We needed to be in much broader areas. We needed the way we worked should be done differently. There were a lot of orthodoxy. So there were a lot of things I wanted to do on that front because I thought we could have more of an impact. In McKinsey, we often would not take the medicine that we would tell other clients to do. So, for example, do strategy. People say we don't do that. Yes, we do need to do that, because how do you know where you're going to be over time? So that was the first thing we focused on, is what type of work should we be doing? Public sector work, restructuring work, what regions of the world should we be in, that type of thing. So doing that. Second is the point you were just alluding to, which is unleashing people. I think McKinsey is pretty good at unleashing people, but it also still has a hierarchy. So how do we give younger people more of a chance to be able to grow and drive things? And, we have an apprenticeship model, or McKinsey has an apprenticeship model, but there are ways to be able to build that. I mean, one example, given the importance of Asia, if you just tried to grow your Asian capability in the normal way, it would take you 50 years. So what we did was build Asian offices in Europe where we had a lot of partners, and then we'd way over hire in Asia, but send people to Europe. They'd get trained by European partners, and they'd 3 years later come back to Asia, and there were a lot of things on the people dimension that could be done and so forth. So it was I felt that being a relevant firm, being a firm that is we're innovative, that we take the medicine that we're giving clients. And we had lots of crises, and there's been lots of crises since. That's the nature of it. But how do we navigate through those things?
Just on that, Dominic, the first thing I was going to ask you is orthodoxy. How do you break with it? Because you talked about it earlier. McKinsey's is known for its innovation, but it is, like you said, it was a pyramid.
Yeah.
And you're going to ask everybody to break with what's been successful, or not throw it all out, obviously, but you changed it dramatically.
Yeah.
It was pretty dramatic, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was to challenge it. I mean, one was, again, the nature of the work we do. And I think by that I meant the doing public service work. And that really came from that Australian experience. I loved the ATO. I learned a lot. I thought we had impact. There's fabulous leaders in the public sector. You get this view in the private sector that public sector people are a bunch of idiots. So that's totally wrong, obviously. And but there's high impact work that we've done. That's one dimension. The second was actually how you work with clients. And this is where one of the orthodoxies were paid fees. I said, why can't we take more risk with clients?
Yeah, that broke the model completely.
And so it was putting fees at risk, if you will. If we don't get results, we don't get paid. If we do get results, and there's obviously, you have to be careful with that and where it is, but that was a challenge. Let's move away from an hourly.
Why did you do it? Why did you do that? Because you up to that point, you're fully retained, you're getting the work, you're getting paid. Why'd you go for the risk part?
Because I felt it would make us act more like owners, if you will. Like you get asked to do a project, I think we have to say, let's act like we own equity in this firm. And what is the best? And I think it can make you bolder, because part of what McKinsey does, I think, is tell truth to power. That's what I also, we would say things that were very uncomfortable. And sometimes that meant we were fired, but that was celebrated in the firm. It was kind of, you have to say the truth. And if you don't, that's malpractice. And if it means you get taken out that's okay. I found that inspiring. If you have more skin in the game, it's even more focused, and you change what you're working on more quickly. You bring the right level of resources. And I saw this with, again, companies like we worked with Ping An Insurance or Kotak in India, and they were small companies. They're saying, look, we'd rather pay you in equity. And I would try that. And the firm was like, are you out of your mind? We're never going to. And it was a good, I think it just puts you on the same side of the table, right? You're not a service provider. You're kind of, in a small way, you're a partner. That was what I was trying to get at. And again, it hasn't all worked exactly, but that's changed, right? And how you do it. This notion of who we hire. So the extreme one was the no university degree, but we broadened it massively. If you recall, diversity in McKinsey in the 60s was seen as, we went from Harvard to Wharton. That was diversity. It was ridiculous. It was unbelievable how narrow we are. So let's go to non-MBAs. Let's hire poets, astrophysicists, others that we can bring in from a different dimension. It's the development of people, how people grow. I think the notion of leaving McKinsey and coming back, I wished I'd done that in my career. So that was what I was trying to change. And I found that you learn how to do change, but every 8 months I would try and change. I would put this like heart paddles, let's try it. And some stuff didn't work, and for good reason. And I think that, but the point is we have to keep challenging ourselves. Otherwise, this gets to a broader theme of those forces at work at the very beginning, where the world is moving faster. What all that means is the metabolic rate of the world has gone up. Like we're on a treadmill. Someone's just cranking it. It was going at 7 kilometers an hour. It's now going at 25. And if you don't change, if your internal organization is slower than the external, you will no longer be relevant. You will die. You will disappear. And the average lifetime of an S&P 500 company in 1935 was 90 years, which wasn't a great time to be on that, 90 years. Today, the average lifetime of an S&P, the last time I looked at it, 2018, was 15 years. So that's because organizations don't change. And that's by the way, back to that long-term capitalism and so forth. While you have a long-term view, I'm amazed in an annual report that we don't have a metric for metabolic rate. What is the metabolic rate of Rio Tinto versus BHP versus any other organization? And that to me is partly you're challenging things, you're trying different things, you're moving. You don't follow every fad, but you're regularly challenging yourself to do it. And I think as a leader, if you're not doing that, you could be taking your organization to irrelevance. Successful, but irrelevant.
There's always dark times as leaders, Dominic.
Yeah.
you're at McKinsey's, and there were some pretty challenging times there. Subprime comments, South Africa, etc., and others that well and truly in the press. Yeah. How do you engage? What does a leader do? How do they act? And how do you bring them forth?
Yeah, there's, as I said, a number of crises. And what I would say is I actually think I dealt with the crises earlier in my term as managing partner than I did later. So my first, I guess, set of crises, just literally when I became the MD, it was in 2009. We had obviously the financial crisis, and that affected McKinsey. I always was told that when things are very good or very bad, it's good for McKinsey in a very narrow, selfish sense of the term, because people need help or they want to do things. No, it's not. When things are bad, it's bad because people can't afford it. They're totally distracted, all of that. So we had the economic situation was challenging. And just as we were coming out of that, so we had to take again the medicine we give our clients. And I remember the CFO at the time, Tom Barkin, who's a very close friend. He's the Federal Reserve president in Richmond in the US now. He would tease me and he would say, "Dom, you're the first managing partner that has negative additional award in history for, because this just doesn't," and he kept every month. It was like, wow, now you're the first to have it for 3 months. I remember I was going, "Tom, this isn't helping." He was teasing me, but I didn't find it comfort. So we had to do some things that were necessary, take medicine to do that. And just as we were coming out, Anil Kumar, senior partner, and Rajat Gupta get arrested for insider trading. And that was devastating because that was at the integrity of the firm. How can it's a senior partner, first of all, but then your former leader, like what? I remember I felt there were a lot of people trying to kill us and were angry, and appropriately so. That was very tough because it was existential, and it broke a lot of people were unconfident. I remember the inflection point for me was, I remember I just moved to London when this had broken out, and I was invited by Gordon Brown with a number of other business leaders just to talk with them. Right, it was number 10 Downing Street. I remember that morning of the meeting, in the front picture of the FT was a picture of Rajat Gupta going into the courthouse. That literally, and it goes like, it's something, I don't remember the exact title, but it was like the end of McKinsey. Like it was just kind of almost clap, like take these guys down, And I was standing there going, wow, this is a great day to go see the Prime Minister. And I just moved to London, and I was sitting there and I was standing, it was raining, and I was standing out there. And finally this Bobby came up to me and said, like, "What are you doing? Like, are you going in or out? Like, make a choice. You can't just stand here." And I remember I said, because I was going, maybe I shouldn't go because of the paper. And I finally said, "God damn it. You got to go in." And I went in, and it was great. Of course, people had read stuff, but it wasn't so that to me was, you lean into you embrace it, and you own it, and you work it, and you drive it. And there were a number of other ones over that 9 years which I did it. And I think, with South Africa, what I wish I did, and that one was it was shocking. I wasn't, and again, our view is we didn't actually do anything wrong. We'd worked with this org. It wasn't 1 or 0. It was there was some, I wished we hadn't worked with it and done the type of arrangement that we'd had, but I didn't see that we'd done. And what I should have done was move there. I should have moved there and just embrace, and own. And I spent a lot of time there, but I think you have to be fully committed. And I'm not saying moving there, but you have to hear what people are saying, to see the anger. And I kind of was hoping it would go away. I think what leaders do is, the first thing is, you obviously don't like crises, and then you want them to go away, and you hope that with time, and that's just wrong. You have to embrace it. And that takes energy to do that. That's the thing where, in a strange way, you'd think, well, I've gone through some, which I think actually went quite well. I get, there can be a arrogance, honestly, that you think it works. And every crisis is different, and and unfortunately, I think as a leader, expect one a year in this volatile world, expect one a year. And then you better be ready to change your calendar and your plans and how you spend your time. It's kind of like, is that Henry Kissinger comment, right? It goes, I'm too busy to have a crisis next week. My calendar's too full. That's kind of what happens. So that's my just very superficial reflection. But I think this is part of life now. You better lean into it, embrace it. Don't hope it goes away, and change what you're doing, because if you don't, it's like a fire. It'll just get out of control.
Rio had a bit of a tough time, as you know.
Yeah.
And particularly in our backyard. But you've come on board as chair. Where are you going to spend your time, Dominic? What's your focus there?
It's over time. And again, I'm thinking again long term, right? And so I think about it in phases. And I think in the first phase, because again, I'm very excited and proud to be part of Rio Tinto. I think it's fundamentally a great company. It's 150 years old. It's gone through a lot. It's got incredible DNA. There's remarkable things that Rio Tinto has done. There's obviously some tragedy and terrible things that have occurred, right? In the Jukin Gorge, we had the culture, the Liz Broderick report and so forth, bullying, racism, sexual harassment. So, mistakes, there's scars on the body, if you will, too, as you go through it. But I fundamentally believe it's a great organization. And so the first phase to me is that we're solidly out of the crisis, and that's regaining social license. And it's Jakob is the one who's really driven that. It's not me. I'm a latecomer, but I want to reinforce and support that. And that's social license. Like in Australia, we lost, as you know better than I think it was. I just talked to colleagues who were in Perth that couldn't wear their kit. They would get spat on. I mean, it was just I don't need to say, just really deep scar tissue on that from that experience. And so our social license, the culture, getting this, and then the four objectives, our operating performance. Rio Tinto, I think, was known, and McKinsey, we would study Rio Tinto as the benchmark for just consistent operating performance and long-term. This was the place, and that's where we should be. So let's get back there. And we're on track to do that. And let's be a growth company. Again, we're really, mining is a really, really important industry. As much as people may not recognize it, it is. And we are not going to do the energy transition without a significant increase in copper, steel, lithium, all of the battery materials that we need. That you need mining companies, and we have a massive supply demand gap. So we're going to have to do that. So it's the first phase is coming out of that crisis with momentum and dealing with the social license and the culture, which I think a lot has been done on. It can never ever assume it's done. We have to, and then moving into growth and performance. And I'm just very keen at the end of my time. I want Rio Tinto to be even more relevant. Like, this is a 150-year company. I'm joining on the conveyor belt. There'll be many more chairmen and chairwomen or whatever coming down the road. But have we taken this to a higher place, if you will? It sounds weird, but that's what we're doing. And that's performance, that's shareholder value, but it's also, again, relevance and importance. It's been a focus on the first phase. I'm spending a lot of time with people in the organization. I traveled a lot at McKinsey, but the travel in the last year has just been because it's Rio's in 35 countries. So you've got to be in Madagascar. You've got to be in Mongolia. It's not just Australia, US, Canada, and it's meeting people, it's spending time with the leadership team. And again, I'm the chair. I'm not the CEO. I think yeah. Rio in the past has gotten into difficulty because chairs have wanted to be CEOs and I think that I have no interest in that. I want to help Jakob, and I want to help the management team in whatever way I can to be successful. And obviously that doesn't mean you won't criticize or challenge or push, but it's that spirit of, we're trying to take this organization from A to B. B is a much higher, and we've got a great team. Let's do whatever we can. So a lot of time with, Jakob and whatever is helpful to him. A lot of time with governments, much more than I thought, just because of the supply chain geopolitics. That's been a huge amount. A lot of time in Washington, a lot of time in Beijing. And I like being in both places. I love Beijing. I like being in Washington.
So you were talking about the growth of the future from Asia and Africa, but also you talked about the new energies of the world and the future of the world and the transition. Where is Rio in that? Because obviously they've built the reputation and the market on existing metals. Now we're looking at the future. Where's the big giants in that space as opposed to the small ones in rare earths, critical minerals, and here's these big guys, BHP and Vale and Rio. Are you advanced? Are you ahead of schedule, behind schedule?
First of all, we're going to need steel. Like the idea that iron ore I think that's a really great asset to have. And obviously I'm biased when I say that, Greg, but I feel very strongly that because there's 900 tons of steel in a the average wind turbine. And so what I would love us to do is not just be relying on the iron ore, which is critical. That doesn't mean to diminish it. We're investing even more, as you know, right? Whether it be in expanding our growth in the Pilbara, but also what we're doing in Simandou and what we're doing in Canada with the Iron Ore Company of Canada. It's got some of the greenest iron ore there. But copper is huge. We don't have anywhere near the amount of copper we need, right? I mean, in my simple-minded way, someone told me, we have discovered, mined, processed 700 million tons of copper since we've existed as humans up to this date. It's over 100,000 years. If we're going to make the net zero targets by 2050, we're going to have to do the equivalent in the next 30 years, 700 million tons. So that's dumbing it down for someone like me to say and by the way, you can't just buy another company. That doesn't solve it.
Don't you see the numbers? Is that achievable or is that pie in the sky?
I think it's going to be very difficult. We're going to have to recycle. We're going to have, there's a whole range we're going to go back to old mine sites and find, just like Rio Tinto started, we remined a Roman mine. And that's what was done in the 1870s. And it was done very well. So I think my point is it's a huge challenge and a big need for us to do it. So I actually think by the way, I have a huge amount of respect for BHP, Vale, the big players that are out there, but we're going to have to go into more challenging parts of the world because these minerals are not in Switzerland. They're in Tajikistan, they're in Central Asia, they're in Africa, and we've got to figure out how to do that in the proper ESG standard way and where it is. And so I think that means we're going to become even more significant. You know what I mean? But we have to drive it and have the right to do it. But I think we're going to become more scaled. And so it's not about dropping anything, it's adding. And our aluminum business, which, some people tease us and say now finally maybe the acquisition price makes, but it's, Rio's the largest producer of aluminum in the Western world right now. And it's green aluminum, right? For the most part. So we have some work to do in Eastern Australia and Gladstone and so forth. But in Canada, that's hydro-powered aluminum. We have ELYSIS technology to be able to smelt it effectively. So I see that is going to become a very important part of what we do. So we're a bulk player, a mining player, but also a processor. And we have China, and China will remain important no matter what happens there long term. It's critically important to us. And North America is important to us. So anyway, I don't want to bore you with all this stuff, but I'm actually very excited about the prospects. We just have to make sure have the social license, we have the right culture, we have the focus, and we deliver on these growth projects that we've launched.
And how are you going with the ESG zealots? They're in there. They're going to keep coming up.
They are. I think the thing, what I find is, one is is just being totally transparent about what's working and what's not working. Because, by the way, the technology is shifting, and this is, we're getting permitting to put solar panels more difficult sometimes than to get the right to mine territories all over the world. I think BP has found that. It's not so permitting and doing renewables can be, I think, even more challenging than the actual mining operations, just on that side. But the other part too, I found is involving. I was just at a CSO. We do it in Australia, we do it in North America, and we do it in Europe. We just did one in London on Monday. So we bring people in the room. And one of the things I've tried and explain is you go at us, like hammer us. But one of the things I sort of say is you need to help us work out some of the trade-offs here. So I'll give you an example. We have resolution in the United States, right? It's 25% it represents 25% of the US copper reserves. The United States government, the Department of Defense, industry wants us to mine that like yesterday. Get off your ass and move on that stuff, right? By the way, if you don't get that copper, how are we going to, make progress toward the net zero? We need the copper. We have to find it. But we have that's the E, we've got the environment element of it. The S side is the social side. Well, guess what? There's one First Nations group out of 11 that absolutely does not want us to do it. Absolutely not. So they're saying, yeah, I get that we need copper but we don't want it done. It's this site has religious significance to us and all. And so then my question is, well, what do you want us to do? Like, how do you square the circle? Because we're either going to burn the planet. I'm not like that, or we meet. You decide. You help us. And what I've said is, you know what? That copper in the ground is like gold in the ground. It's just going to get more and more valuable. So what I think we have to do is also confront this a bit and put it on the table for the different groups and say, you need to figure this out. Or some of the real, if I could just call it, extremists on the environment front, and I don't think they understand the mining industry. And my view is to say, get real. And by the way, some of them fly on private jets to protest to us. And I like to point that out and say, it's interesting. We're actually trying to create and build the materials to be able to do this. And you don't want us to do it. Tell me how you're going to get to the net zero. I don't understand. And I think we have to be blunt and forceful and confront it and not be mealy-mouthed about it. So it is, to your point, it does get hot.
Are you selling the argument well or not then?
I think we are doing a very poor job as an industry. I think, first of all, the mining industry globally is being sort of in the dark because you guys rip shit out of the ground, carbon emit, blah, blah. And we have to say, you know what? Yeah, we do that, but we are fundamental to this, one of the most important challenges humanity's, which is the energy transition and climate change. But we got to kind of get out of the darkness and talk and be proud about what we do. Earth science is really important. Material science is really, really important. We're not going to have this stuff. And I think we've got to make that clearer to people, have people understand so we've got a long way to go, because I think we've been in this past era where we've been pillared. The only place where I feel, and you have to tell, in Australia at least, I feel there's some respect for mining, what mining has done.
It saves us all the time, but there's a lot of pushback, Dominic. Don't underestimate it.
Well, the other thing is it's also helped transform big part the world. Australia has transformed China, and whenever I'm in Shanghai or in Beijing, and I do it especially now, I always, whatever meeting I say, look out the window and look at all that steel in those buildings. That is courtesy of Western Australia. That is what you wouldn't have this. I know Brazil's done something too, but frankly, that transformation has been driven by Australia. And this is where I think we have to be proud about that and point that out, and point out again to make it, and talking about car batteries, and and say, do you know how much aluminum is in a car? Do you know how much lithium is in a copper? Electric vehicles have 3 times more copper than in a combustion. Where do you think that comes from? How are we going to get that material? So I think there's a huge opportunity for us as an industry to explain what we do and help people understand where it is, and that we're critical. But it's up to us. People are not going to do it for us. And there's this image issue, particularly in other parts of the world, that needs to be changed.
Do you think, Dominic, just as maybe as a generalization, a lot of leadership just feels browbeaten? Corporate leadership, because we look at some of across the board, it just they seem to be very fearful of coming out. It's going to be twisted. It's going to be turned on them. They can't control the media, but therefore we're losing dialogue as a result too.
I think it's a great point. I actually totally agree with you. I think most leaders are afraid to be with the media because you just never know what might happen or how it turns out, or how you get a clip taken of what you've said that's sort of out of context. So the best thing is to kind of not say anything. And I actually think the reverse. We should be out there. Myself, always have second thoughts. Like I do the thing in the FT, because you never know what they're going to pick up. They're looking for a soundbite. But I think if we don't go out there and take some risk, how is anyone going to even know what we're trying to do? And I think as long as you're totally up on it, like you're not trying to, you're just straight up about what you're doing, you're fact-based, and you push back when people challenge on things that you don't think right. I'd be aggressive. Like we have to be aggressive. Say that's bullshit. That's not right. That's not fair. That doesn't make sense. That's not how I see it. Or by the way, this is what we do. Do you understand that? Once you come and look at what we do and see how it works, and I think if we're not out there personally, no one's going to be out there for us. So, but I agree. People are nervous. They're afraid. There's just too many cases of people being taken down because they said something off, in a small, you know what I mean? But I think that's the nature of the job. You got to be out there, and we got to do it. And we have to do it with government too. We have to be on the front foot, talking, explaining, doing whatever we can, because no one's going to do it for us.
Dominic, a lot of Rio's earnings come out of Australia. Does Australia play a big enough game in the whole thinking? No, it's a major contributor to where Rio is going. Outside of the brand name, are we on the world stage?
I think we are, but I think there's much more to be done. So I'll get just a specific example. Rio, and I'm sure it's the case with BHP too. One thing that I found surprising, which is great, is the number of countries that want Rio to be there. So Saudi Arabia now does a mining conference, right? They did the second one last year, and it's fantastic. And because they recognize the importance of where it is, and they bring mining ministers from 30 countries in places that we wouldn't normally operate, and they want Rio, and BHP too. I don't want to just make it up, but they want us there. And I cannot tell you the number of places, including in North America, where people want Rio. There's a capability. There's a deep respect for what the company has done. It's nothing to do with me, all right? It's to do with the track record of what has been done. People know about the automated trains, the Perth, the center, the digital twin of the Mongolian mine that we have in Brisbane. People understand that. And this is, again, even in Africa, people want, in Guinea, big part of it, people want Rio Tinto there because you guys know how to build things, and you know how to do it properly. You do it at scale. And that's Australia. That I think that is from the brand, and it's from the Australian experience that gives the license to do these things in other parts of the world. It's more our own things we have to deal with, which is risk, right? Operating in these places is riskier, and that's where. But the reputation, I just want to say, of the organization because of what has been done in Australia is extraordinary. I'll tell you, when I was at Tech Resources, I was the chair, and we were doing the QB2 build, right? The copper mine in Chile. I remember Norm Keevil telling me, because we need to have Rio Tinto involved. And I remember going, why would we do that? Like, why are we going to share Rio? And he goes, because Rio Tinto knows how to build things. They have And there's few organizations in the world that know how to build things, and they have a quality standard that is extraordinarily high, and a track record is just good. It's if you can have them in. And I remember I was at Tech. Tech has lots of choices. They're great. I'm just saying I remember Norm Keevil is one of these mentors for me, a guy who, I think has had incredible, he's got a long-term view. He's built a great company. So I think that the reputation is there. I just think there's more of a role for Rio and BHP and other companies in this whole energy transition in the world, because we're needed. And small companies don't have the platform, and that's an overused word, but what I mean by that is we can actually take a lot of risk. We have a lot of capacity and experience to be able to build things in complicated places. We have the capital base to be able to do it. You need to have big operators to be able to take the risk and have the experience to be able to do things. I mean, Rincon, where we're in Argentina doing this listening thing. This is the airport that had to be built up there. This is an unbelievable altitude. I think it's the fourth highest airport in the world. With the engineering team, and that team is a team fundamentally based out of Brisbane. Mark Davies' team, Charles Zimmerman. What they've done and the speed with which they've done it, it's extraordinary. I mean, and this is where sometimes when I'm looking at construction work here in the UK and it's taking, 6 months to do a road, I feel like let's just get Rio in here and they'll do it on a weekend. There's just a capacity, and people see that, just go, wow, this is a time in the world where we need people who know how to build things fast, at scale, and properly. So that's why I think I'm so excited about the future, because it's a broad range of things that we can do and a broad range of capabilities that we have in the organization that have not been unleashed.
LeapFrog Investments, you're chairman of that. Am I going to get a return when I invest?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm excited about LeapFrog because back to this capitalism thing, I think we need more private capital in emerging markets. We're not going to have Africa develop by giving them more aid. It's a drop in the bucket. We need the capital market to come in. The capital market is not going to come in unless it gets a return. They're just not interested. And what we're trying to do at LeapFrog is bring private capital from pension funds, family offices, and others, people who want a return. They're not doing this they have stakeholders, and we want them to have private equity returns. We want to have a 15 to 25%, 15 minimum, 25% return from investments that we make, because that's how we're going to get the capital in. So performance is essential. It's not impact and therefore we can have less performance. It's both. And actually they reinforce each other. The impact part is because we're focused on this emerging consumer. At the core are people with less than $11 a day, very, very poor people that actually, because of technology now, can get included in the financial system, can get healthcare, can get access to energy. And there are now companies that are being formed that operate because of technology with very low prices, but good margins, and they're successful. And so that's where it is. I argue we have to have very good private equity returns, but focused on a population that really is missing, is not included. And we can do both. And that's what we're driving. So I'm excited by that. And I'm very excited by the companies that have been formed.
And I think you said during your career, you've advised over 3,500 chief execs?
Yeah, I've met 3,500. I don't want to exact, because in McKinsey, I had this rule of I had to see 2 CEOs a day or 2 leaders a day, because what I was worried was we were becoming, this is back to the change. People, as organizations get bigger, they tend to get focused on what their internal role is as opposed to what we're supposed to be doing. And my view in McKinsey, you're serving clients. That is the coin of the realm. Your role, who gives a crap? And so my view is, as the leader of this place, I'm going to be externally focused. I'm not going to be spending my time figuring out what the office furniture should look like in the New York office. You're out there. And so that was why no matter what, even if I had a board meeting that was going on, I would leave the board meeting either to go visit someone or I would pick up the phone. And so every single day I talked to two CEOs, no matter what. I was religious. It was like a saying prayers or whatever you wanted, whatever your thing is, doing your action. It was two CEOs. I don't know how many of that. I don't know the number of that. There's quite a lot.
Without giving away too much, just maybe one or two. Who made the lasting impression on you as CEOs?
Oh, there were so many from different dimensions. One person I would say is I've talked about Paul Keating before. He was the treasurer. He was sort of the ultimate. That guy, even though we weren't actually talking about the project, he changed my important mindset, as I said, about Asia, long-term thinking, public sector.
Didn't go to university either.
Didn't go, exactly. That's a great point. I didn't even think about that. That's exactly right. The other one was Chairman Lee at Samsung. I was involved. We were doing a turnaround work after the crisis in 1997. He was amazing. He didn't speak English, and I probably met him 4 times. And I won't bore it, but he was one who his view, like I have to just tell you a couple of things about him. So we're doing this work after the financial crisis. Samsung didn't have a CFO. So all of a sudden interest rates went from like 8% to 22%. They were borrowing money in US dollars unhedged. So all of a sudden the yuan depreciated. So this company, which we all know of now, was close to the wall. So we had a project called, literally the project was Project Won, WON, like cent. Like we got to find every single one to keep this place. So we were like literally sell the goddamn furniture if we need. Like it was. So we're doing this work, and I would report to him. This is how we're doing it. And one day I came into the Samsung headquarters, and there was this graphic all over the place, and it had like arrows going up, like a lightning bolt going up, and it in Korean, and it said "beat Sony." That I remember Sony in the 90s.
The Walkman and all that, yeah.
So they were they were like top of the house. Like that was just they were the Apple of today, right?
That's right, yeah.
And this is Samsung. We're at the wall, and he's got these signs out there going "beat Sony," and I literally walked in. That's about Truth Power, and I said, Chairman Lee, I said, what? I literally said, what the hell are these signs? And he looked at me and translation, and he says, what are you talking about? I said, what are you doing putting a sign like "beat Sony"? And we're in the basement. We're not. And then he literally came over to me, and I remember he tapped my hand, and then he spoke. And when the basic translation came back, he goes, Dom, that's why I never asked you for advice. And I said, what are you? And he goes, listen, if you think you're going to motivate people by telling them we're going to save every one, you motivate people by if we get through this crisis, we can beat any company on earth. That's the message I'm giving. So that was a kind of a mindset shift too, right? About ambition and how you mobilize people. And the other thing he said to me, because we were involved in when they moved from Samsung products were low end products at that time, right? A lot of people, they would be in Walmart, and his view was, we're going to change. Samsung's going to become a high-end brand and all of this stuff. And I remember having one of these conversations with him again, saying it's very difficult to do this. It takes a long time.
That's right.
I just want you to know and I went on and on like this. And he did this. He goes, do you know our history? And I said, pretty well. He goes, I don't think you do. Do you know what our first business was? I said, no. He goes, so you don't know our history. It was yeast. We made yeast. So I think we know how to transform ourselves, boy. It was but that guy, I loved him because he was elite. He was an amazing person in terms of how he drove things. Larry Fink, even though I didn't work direct, I was more in the managing director role at that time, but just he was part of this group on long-term capitalism that we had of how to think, get the capital markets to work that way, his talent views, his energy and how he focused on things, his courage to drive things. Anyhow, those are just some people I'm probably, then there were the people like John Teets, Dial Corporation, no university background, he told me, I remember he said, I had to stop school at grade 8 because my parents died in a fire. I had to take care of my siblings, so I had to work. But he's like he's always reading, he's learning, you know what I mean? That I can see him right in front of me right now, just to, again, beating me around the head and doing stuff. So there's a lot of, I know I'm missing some. Andrew McKenzie is a guy I used to meet him when I was at McKinsey, and he was just talking about what he wanted to do and how he wanted to drive things, what he was doing on diversity, right? People laughed at him. I'm going to go 40-40-20. He moved. Another guy was John Prescott. It's an old debt because I did a CEO time thing, and I thought I was being fired from the firm. I learned what a CEO is like because I was mainly working with the secretary. But I was literally looking at what it was like a day to day for a CEO. That was an unbelievable experience. Anyhow, sorry, I'm just rambling here. These are, Jamie Dimon. I remember him telling me that we were talking about things. By the way, a couple of things. I did it again. They're learnings for me. He said, if you think you or your firm can out-analyze me, go home. And he goes, and he looked at me and I was like, and he goes, on Saturdays, I read mortgage tables for fun. I was like, okay, I've got it. And then he said, second point, and these are from many different meetings and so forth, but he said, you guys, you think that you make decisions, you like to make decisions with 90% confidence. Facts. I get it. I like the fact that you analyze stuff, but in this world that's moving faster and is more volatile, sometimes we have to make decisions with 60% or sometimes 40%. And then if you're wrong, you just change. And he said and he'd hired a guy from McKinsey in strategy who was a superstar. I was really upset that he'd left. And he used to tease me. He said, so this guy would come in to their executive committee and say, look, we've done some work and our hypothesis is we should go this way. And Jim and I were like, what do you mean by your hypothesis? He goes, well, it's, we have to do more work to prove it up, but that's what we think it is. And Jim and I says, how about this? We actually think that's the right thing to do. So we're going to do it. And this guy freaked out and said, you can't do that because we haven't got the analysis done. And he said, watch me, we're going to do it. And he said, it drove and they did it. Right. So it's learning about leadership or management from different people. And another person, not from McKinsey, who I learned a lot from. His name is Don Cameron, but he changed his name to Zulu Khan. He worked in a sawmill in northern British Columbia in Fort Nelson, Takama Forest Products. He's about 6'8", had a beard in the shape of a zigzag, like a what he thought I think was a Zulu warrior, wore overalls all the time. And I worked in this sawmill, and the story I just want to say is he was the shop steward. There was going to be a strike, and this was important. Like, I needed the job and all, and I was actually worried we're going to raise the labor costs, and we're going to take this mill will get shut down. We're not competitive with the Scandinavian ones. And I remember in this meeting, he said, okay, we're going for the strike. Does anyone dissent on this? Right. And everyone had their hands down. He's like this big, so I put my hand up and said, I don't think we should do it. And I explained why, right? Everyone was looking at me. And then he said to me, Dom, how would you like to walk on your kneecaps for the rest of your life? And I said, I actually would not prefer to do that. And he goes, then you shut the F up. And I said, I got it. I thought you really wanted an opinion. He goes, no, you don't understand. We've already made our decision and we need alignment. And if you aren't aligned, then maybe you're going to have a fall in one of the chippers. But he was sort of smiling. And I actually thought I should quit. I said, this guy's going to hunt me down, or, I've never seen this. And he actually became a very good friend. Like, again, a guy, he said, listen, I know I'm not an idiot. I understand this is not about that. This is about a power dynamic that's going on with the management that's long since before you were here. And maybe before you talk, you should ask questions. That's my point. You know what I mean? So here was this guy who was a rough, but I can see him in front of me right now, just the same, a frightening guy, but actually very, like a thoughtful guy about what he was actually trying to get done. So in negotiations, I learned something from him.
You've been in the inner sanctum of most CEO offices than anyone else. What would you want CEOs or encourage CEOs to think about now in this troubled times that we'd started off in our conversation?
I think a couple of things. I think if there's ever a time for a voice from business in this kind of crazy period of time where we don't have enough long-term leadership, we need people to speak up, even if it's uncomfortable, to say what they think, be open about whether you're being, it's selfish for your company. You need to have a voice. I think it's very important to speak up and have courage. It's easy to keep your head down. It's better, people will say, because it's so volatile and you never know what you might. I think it's important to stick your head above the parapet and say something. And I think it's even more critical than it ever has been to do it. So to stand up. I think the second thing is the challenge your orthodoxies. Don't assume that what has worked before is going to work ahead. Be open to be curious about ideas. Be comfortable that you may have to do things differently. And the third is keep your energy, because this is going to be it's a way harder role now than I think it was 10 years ago. And it'll be even harder 10 years from now. And this is not an issue about managing your time. It's managing your energy. And how do you keep your alertness, your ability to absorb? Because I think mistakes get made when you're tired, you're frustrated, you're exhausted at the end of a day or long flights, and just make sure you manage your energy, because it's relentless, and know how to recover so you have that energy. So those would be three aspects I'd say.
And Dominic, if you're looking back at that young man who was in the back of the four-wheel drive with Idi Amin all those years ago, what advice would you give him now?
Follow your instincts and don't put barriers in front of yourself because of what you think other people do. Take risk, follow your intuition. Because again, in that car, I went in that car because I liked Land Rovers and I wanted to play. I did not want to be sitting beside Idi Amin. I mean, I don't, but that was in retrospect, it was a good experience. And so what's going through my mind is you take risk, speak up, try things. When people say, oh, I think that's a really bad idea, that's not good for your career, or they make it more about, I'm not sure that's right for you, that my radar would go up, well, maybe this is something. And every time, and it's not always worked out. I've made many, as you know, many mistakes. I've screwed up. There's things I wish I hadn't done, but I found that when I've been really nervous about, it's a big decision, and people are telling you, be careful, like going to China, that business ambassador. I had so many people saying, it's impossible. You can't do it. And I actually thought, it probably is. I'm so grateful for my own, that I did it, because you figure it out. So, and that's sort of an intuition. And often the riskier ones go with your gut, your heart. Take the risk, plunge.
On that, Dominic, thank you very much for your time today. Greatly appreciated.
No, thank you. Really enjoyed the discussion with you.
You have been listening to No Limitations.